Okay, so cards on table time, right from the off. I hate quote mining. I like Steven Pinker. So if you have a sort of confluence of those two things, it's going to get under my skin a little bit. This is a perfect confluence of those things. I want to talk about quote mining here, and two of the worst, most egregious examples of quote mining that I can see. One from an organisation that I wouldn't really expect very much better, and another from somebody else that I wouldn't expect very much better, but I ought to expect very much better because he's a professor. So effectively what had happened is Steven Pinker had taken part in a panel that was organised by Spiked magazine, of course, those vanguards of free speech, on the idea of political correctness and the idea, the possibility that perhaps political correctness in some instances could be inadvertently doing the exact opposite of what it wishes to do, because of course one of the primary functions I think of political correctness is to try and oppose hard right thinking, more explicitly nowadays over the last year or so, alt-right thinking, but that in some cases it might be doing the exact opposite of that. And that was the case that Steven Pinker was trying to outline in an 8-minute monologue he gave as part of that panel. And I've rarely seen something so universally and disgustingly quote mined as that. Just let me say on the subject of quote mining, because it is to some extent the bane of the online world. It confounds so many of the discussions that we try to have, because depressingly there seems to be a very high proportion of people. Anybody can inadvertently quote mine, don't get me wrong. I've done it myself accidentally and apologised for it. But a disappointingly high number of people that are willing to quote mine if it fulfills their ends as they see it. But there's two levels of quote mines. And I suppose the first level of quote mines represents 95% of the quote mines that you see, which is where you take what somebody has said and you just twist it round a little bit. So it's just qualitatively a little bit different from what they meant. But the general direction of travel is still the same. But then there's another level, which is where you take a fraction of what somebody said, disregard entirely half of it, the qualifying bits at the end which place the context for the first bit, such that you turn around what they've said 180 degrees and then claim that what they've said is the exact opposite of what they are actually saying. It's the equivalent of me saying something like, I hate women, not. Right? And then you just quoting those first three words and leaving off the last one. That's the kind of level of quote mining that I'm talking about here. And the kind of quote mining that Steven Pinker's had on this speech. Let me just outline what the speech was about to put you in the picture. I will, of course, give you a link to this, and I advise you to watch it. It's an easy 8 minutes to watch because it's good thinky stuff. Even if you don't agree with what he's saying, it's good thinky stuff. So what he's basically saying was that he's making the claim that there are certain things that it's kind of verboten to talk about on university campuses, and that there's a consequence to this. It might be done with all the right intentions, but the problem is it's effectively meant that there are some things, some truths, some facts out there which can't be discussed on university campuses. And the problem with this is that even if you're a reasonably intelligent and articulate person, if the first time you come across those facts, they are being presented to you by somebody with perhaps more nefarious means, right? Perhaps somebody who is genuinely a racist and a sexist and a bigot, then the first portrayal you're going to have, the first insight you get into those facts, the first analysis you have of those facts is going to be from that person of nefarious ends. That's the problem that he says. And so people are not immunised to it in the way we are for most facts. Normally when we come across something like that, we already have some idea of the scope of the arguments on either side. And so he saw that as an issue, and as a result of that is what he talked about. And he mentioned some of these facts, and then he gave the qualifiers. If we talked about these things more openly in the university context, etc., then people would have these counter-arguments that they could provide. But in lieu of those counter-arguments, groups like the alt-right can swoop in and have a greater effect. So that's what he'd said. Let me show you the quote mines. First from the Daily Stormer. And let me say that this was the first. Let me say first that I get so used to people crying wolf online and saying how terrible somebody is and how terrible some organisation is and how terrible some website is, how a bunch of absolute evil bastards they all are. And then when I go there, I find it's nowhere near as bad as I thought it was going to be. I'd never been to the Daily Stormer, but I can say when I went to the Daily Stormer, it lived up to its billing. Okay, so let me show you the Daily Stormer article. And this is the article in the Daily Storm, and let me warn you, it's pretty hard stuff to listen to. It's written by a guy called Roy Batty, titles it Big Nibba, and yeah, I had to Google that. Harvard Jew professor admits the alt-right is right about everything. This is what Roy wrote, or some of what Roy wrote. Stephen race-worn now Pinker has spilled the beans about his secret admiration for the alt-right. In front of a panel, the Harvard psychology professor just couldn't hold it in anymore and revealed his power level. He then included a link to a YouTube video that shows just a choice part of Steven Pinker's little speech there, which takes away the context of what he was saying. Roy Batty carries on. Steve lets it all hang out and points out that niggers are subhuman, violent savages that are a menace to themselves and the rest of society. He even goes a step further and says that sand niggers are the leading cause of Alua Akbaring in the white world. He goes on later. Steve put me in the oven last Pinker. He's admitting that the J left has gone too far and that intelligent minds have started to rebel against their PC dogma. Okay, so this is exactly what I mean by quote mining something to the point where it's the diametric opposite of what is being said. He actually wasn't showing any admiration for the alt-right whatsoever. He was saying that even intelligent, literate people can be susceptible to this, that if the first time you come up against an uncomfortable fact, rather than it being presented in an environment where you can hear the arguments on all sides and you can hear the complexities that are involved in these things and the social and cultural factors that can be involved. But instead of that, if the first time you're presented with this uncomfortable fact, it's being presented by a Roy Batty, who will tell you that the reason that black crime statistics are the way that they are is because niggers are subhuman, violent savages that are a menace to themselves and the rest of society, that is not a very healthy set of circumstances. But Roy Batty portrays this in exactly the opposite way round, as if this is showing some kind of admiration for the alt-right. It's exactly the opposite is what Steven Pinker was doing here. But let's set this to one side, because I think you can tell by the tone of this piece. The Daily Stormer, right, it is not something that we should expect a high degree of journalistic integrity from, right? But surely from a professor you would expect a little bit more. Well, maybe not if that professor's Professor P.Z. Myers, because by now his reputation precedes him. But nevertheless, even having known P.Z. Myers and his ways for nearly 6 years now, it still shocks me when I see him pull off the kind of stunt that I'm going to show you here. That somebody who is an academic, whose job it is to inform and illuminate the minds of individuals, is nevertheless so willing to deceive his audience in so deliberately manipulative ways as PZ has shown again and again and again. Okay, so let me show you what happened here. First, let me say that he wrote this post and he wrote this blog entry entitled, "If You Ever Doubted That Steven Pinker's Sympathies Lie with the Alt-Right." And throughout the thread of this blog post, there is one thing that I cannot take absolute issue with that may have some truth, which is the claim that P.Z. Myers is making, that when Steven Pinker says that there are these things that cannot be discussed on university campuses, P.Z. Myers is responding, well, that's bollocks, actually. All these things can be discussed on university campuses. You show us, Steven Pinker, that they can't be and that they're not being. That's the bit that he contests, and that bit I don't know about, right? P.Z. Myers might be right about that. But unfortunately, he does so much more in this blog piece, and I just want to show you one example of this. Okay, so this was what Steven Pinker had said in the first part of his speech about race.
When they are exposed to the first time to true statements that have never been voiced in college campuses or in the New York Times or in respectable media, that are almost like a bacillus to which they have no immunity, and they are immediately infected with both a feeling of outrage that these truths are unsayable, and no defense against taking them to what we might consider to be rather repellent conclusions. Let me give you some examples. Here's a third fact that is just not controversial, although it sounds controversial, and that is that different ethnic groups commit violent crimes at different rates. You can go to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, look it up on their website. The homicide rate among African Americans is about 7 or 8 times higher than it is among European Americans.
So that was what Steven Pinker said at the start of his speech about the issue of race and crime. And P.Z. Myers, in his blog, actually does exactly the same tactic as the Daily Stormer. P.Z. Myers uses the same tactic as the Daily fucking Stormer in that he just links to that first section of the speech and doesn't allow us to see the follow-up section of the speech, which I will play you along with time codes, as I already do, which contextualizes what he was saying in that first section. And this is what P.Z. Myers goes on to write. Different ethnic groups commit violent crimes at different rates. Oh yeah, he went there. Look at crime statistics and all those violent black criminals. We're done. That's all the analysis you need to do. But why do black communities have higher crime rates? It wouldn't have anything to do with poverty or discriminatory policing or the existence of laws that basically criminalise being poor, would it? You know, 2 comments that I've got to say with that. The first is that on one hand, P.Z. Myers' central theme of this is, of course we can talk about these things, and yet the first thing he says is, oh yeah, he went there. In other words, oh my God, I can't believe he's talking about this. I can't believe he's mentioning these crime statistics. But then he tries to portray to his blog commenters the idea that Steven Pinker never discusses these other factors. And then, of course, he's following up the fact that he's showing them a clip from this video where he hides the bit that Steven Pinker says later on in the speech. And does the trick work? Yes, the trick works. Let me read you some comments that were left by some of his commenters. Alt X. Oh look, another white man telling people I'm a criminal and something less because of my skin's melanin levels. How so very brave of him to speak up against the left and their calls for equality. How does he find the courage to speak up? Sad. I love how the white, thinky, rational bros love to focus on ethnicity and violence and not on gender and violence. Marcus Ranham. That's a full-blown eugenicist's argument right there. It's a form of post hoc reasoning that can only be engaged if you ignore the potential other causes of an effect. And it's such sloppy thinking that Pinker's public intellectual license needs to be reprivatised. Here's another form of Pinker's statement which may make it a bit more obvious. Certain ethnic groups get shot by police more than others. Does that mean that those ethnic groups are more likely to be bad people, or that the police are disproportionately shooty? Pinker ought to be aware of the studies that correlate exposure to lead-based paint and gasoline fumes, poverty and violent crime, or he's been dozing off in his armchair for the last few years. It's just one example of the many ways that crime and poverty are linked. And yes, race and poverty are linked as well. I didn't realise that Pinker was such a shallow and bad thinker. Okay, so now let me play you the clip of what Pinker says later on in this little 8-minute speech.
Now, if you've never heard these facts before and you stumble across them or someone mentions them, it is possible to come to some extreme conclusions, such as that women are inferior, that African Americans are naturally violent. Now, these are unwarranted conclusions because for each one of these facts, there are very powerful counterarguments for why they don't license racism and sexism and anarcho-capitalism and so on. Number 2, the principle of opposition to racism and sexism is not a factual claim that the sexes and races are indistinguishable in every aspect. It's a political and moral commitment to treat people as individuals as opposed to prejudging them by the statistics of their group. Third, we know that some of the statistical generalizations about races and sexes change over time. So what is true now may not necessarily be true in 10 or 20 years. While you can believe that differences between the races exist and be very strongly opposed to any form of racism. In the case of, say, rates of violent crime, it used to be, go back 100 years, the rate of violent crime among Irish Americans was far higher than among other ethnic groups. That obviously changed. There's no reason that that can't change in the case of current racial differences.
So I've played you that, so you know. You know the full context now. You've seen the context of what Steven Pinker was saying. You know. I know. PZ Myers knows, but most of his commenters don't know. Most of his commenters have this false impression that Steven Pinker is claiming that the reason that black people commit more crime in the United States is just because they're more inherently violent. And why do they have that idea? Because PZ Myers has given them that idea. That's why we know it isn't true. PZ Myers will know it isn't true because he will have watched the full clip, but he's done it anyway. He has done it anyway. And this is the bit that gets me, because PZ Myers has been around long enough to know how this works. He knows how to deceive his audience, and he even knows how to deceive his audience and cover his tracks. What he does in this blog is he starts his blog off there. Just watch this clip, and then cynically just gives the first 2 minutes 56 so that it throws everything that Steven Pinker says out of context. And then right at the end of the blog, he has a little line of hypertext there saying, oh, if anybody's interested, this is a link to the full 8-minute speech. He knows that 99% of people will watch the bit that he says, oh, just watch this, and won't click on that link at the end. He knows that, and we can see that from the comments that are left. Go and read the other comments that are there, and you will see that on all 4 of these truths that Steven Pinker talks about, PZ Myers has managed to get his audience to get the wrong end of the stick on every single one of them. I find that shocking. I find that shocking that somebody of the purported standing of PZ Myers, that a fucking professor would do something along those lines and actually make that his hobby over a period of years, because this is really not a one-off. That's the bit that I find abhorrent, but there's a bit amongst all of this that I find sinister. Go and read PZ Myers' blog. The whole thrust of this article about Steven Pinker is this wide-eyed, innocent, I really don't know what you're talking about, Stephen. This idea that we can't talk about these things at universities. Of course we can talk about these things at universities. Who's trying to stop anybody talking about these things at universities? I'll be honest with you. If PZ Myers had just been up front and said, yeah, we shouldn't talk about these things at universities, and if anybody tries to talk about these things at universities, we should do our level best to shut them up, right? I have issues with that, but at least I'd know he was on the level. What he actually ends up doing in this blog is much more devious. It's almost like a kind of manifestation of one of these super injunctions. You know, these injunctions where not only do you have an injunction stopping you talking about something, but you can't even mention the fact you've got an injunction. It's a little bit of an equivalent to that, in that what he's saying is, well, on the one hand he's saying, well, of course you can talk about these things at universities, who's stopping you talking about these things? But at the same time he's firing that shot across the Steven Pinkers of this world's bows and showing them, if you do want to talk about these things, bear in mind there are consequences. You talk about these kinds of things, and these are the kind of tactics that are going to be employed. Expect us to misrepresent you across the whole of social media so that the world out there at large thinks that you believe and you are claiming something entirely different to what you actually believe. So yeah, of course you can talk about these things, but there's a hidden narrative. The hidden narrative is if you really dare to step foot across that line, then the gloves are off. Anything, no matter how dirty the fucking tactics is, no tactics are out of bounds as far as we are concerned. That I find seriously, seriously devious. Okay, I'll leave you with that. But unlike unlike the PZ Myers and Daily fucking Stormers of this world, right? And in some ways you can group these cunts together, I think, in terms of the way that they operate, obviously not in terms of their beliefs, but in terms of the way that they operate. I will link you to everything, and I will absolutely encourage you. Go and read the Daily Stormer article, please. It will enlighten you as to what they're like. And you'll know that I'm not quoting them out of context. Go and have a look at PZ Myers' blog. I'll link you it. It won't take you many minutes to read it. And go and have a look. I showed you some clips of Steven Pinker's speech. I gave you the time codes so you can go and see the context in which he said the things that he said. You can go and fill in the blanks. Go and have a look. It's 8 minutes. It's worth watching. Okay, thank you for watching this. Bye for now.